morning sunlight poured into the small cafe, casting a warm glow over the polished tables and the steam rising from the coffee machines. The place was already buzzing with customers, the clinking of cups and low hum of conversations filling the air. Among the staff, a young waitress moved swiftly, her steps practiced and careful. She balanced a tray of drinks in her hands, weaving through the narrow aisles with the precision of someone who had been working here for years. Her uniform was simple, neat, and clean, though worn at the edges from constant washing and long shifts. She smiled politely at each customer, taking orders with patience and filling requests as quickly as she could. Every day was a challenge, not because the work was impossible, but because life outside the cafe had its own burdens. Bills stacked on her small kitchen counter, a rent that seemed to rise faster than her paycheck, and the constant worry about her aging parents all weighed on her shoulders. Yet, she carried herself with quiet determination, a dignity that never faltered even when days were long and exhausting. It was during one of these ordinary mornings that he walked in. The CEO was a man whose presence seemed to fill the room immediately. He wore an impeccably tailored suit, a watch that gleamed under the cafe lights, and his shoes were polished to perfection. He carried himself with a confidence, or perhaps arrogance, that made heads turn. Customers whispered, some curious, others impressed, as he entered with two companions. The waitress noticed him instantly, not because of any fame or news she might have heard, but because of the sharpness in his eyes and the way he moved with purpose. She approached his table with her usual calm smile. "Good morning, sir. How may I help you today?" He looked her up and down, a smirk forming on his lips. "Just bring me a coffee. Make it strong. And don't take too long, we don't have all day." Her smile did not falter, though inside she felt a twinge of irritation. She had been mocked before by customers who assumed she was slow or incapable, but there was something different about the way he spoke. It wasn't just impatience. It was a clear, cutting judgment, as if he enjoyed asserting his superiority over someone he considered beneath him. She nodded politely and hurried to the counter, preparing his order with meticulous care. As she worked, she noticed the CEO's gaze following her movements, sharp and critical. Every pour of coffee, every stir of sugar, seemed to be examined and judged. Her colleagues glanced nervously at each other, aware that this was not the kind of customer one could ignore. The cafe had seen wealthy and influential people before, but few carried the air of entitlement that this man had. When she returned to the table with the coffee and a small plate of pastries, he raised an eyebrow. "Make sure the pastries are fresh. I don't want anything stale," he said in a tone that left no room for discussion. "Yes, sir. Everything is fresh," she replied, her voice steady. He chuckled, a sound that was more mocking than amused. "I suppose I should thank you for even being able to manage that," he added, leaning back in his chair. His companions laughed lightly, but not entirely at her expense. It was more about the amusement of witnessing his sharp tongue at work. The waitress kept her smile, but inside, she felt the familiar burn of humiliation. She had learned to mask her emotions in situations like this, to survive without drawing attention, but the sting was always there. As he sipped his coffee, he continued to make cutting remarks, this time about the cafe itself. "Is this the best you can do? I've seen better places in smaller towns," he said, shaking his head. His companions nodded, pretending to agree, though there was a hint of discomfort in their expressions. The waitress nodded politely, offering small reassurances. "We strive to provide the best experience for our customers, sir," she said softly. Despite the harsh words, she did not falter. She knew that reacting angrily would only worsen the situation. She focused on her work, clearing empty tables, refilling water glasses, and checking in on other customers with the same attentive care she always did. She noticed small things about the CEO, how he tapped his fingers impatiently when things were not immediately brought to him, how he observed other patrons and staff with a critical eye. It was clear he was used to being in control, used to having people respond to him without question. As the morning went on, she began to understand more about him, even from brief interactions. There was a sense of urgency in his movements, a meticulousness that suggested he was constantly managing things beyond the cafe. Yet beneath the polished exterior, there was a tension, a flicker of worry that he tried to hide behind his confident demeanor. It was subtle, but she noticed it. The slight hesitation when he answered his phone, the way he glanced around the room as if expecting something unexpected to happen. Other customers began to notice the tension between them as well. Some whispered to each other, wondering why this man seemed so critical of someone just doing her job. The waitress, meanwhile, kept her focus, determined not to let anyone see her emotions unravel. She knew that professionalism was her shield, and today, more than ever, she needed it. During a brief lull, she took a moment to breathe, wiping her hands on her apron. Her mind wandered briefly to her own life, her family, her small apartment, the stack of unpaid bills waiting at home. The contrast between her world and his was stark. He sat there, a symbol of power and wealth, while she moved quietly among the tables, unnoticed except when he chose to mock her. Yet, despite the disparity, she felt a quiet sense of strength. She had faced challenges before, survived difficult days, and carried herself with dignity even when others did not respect her. Today was no different. When the CEO finally finished his coffee, he signaled for the bill. "Make sure this is correct," he said, flipping through the receipt with a critical eye. She checked the total carefully, ensuring everything matched, and handed it to him with a polite, "Here you go, sir." He glanced at it, his expression unreadable for a moment, then smirked. "Not bad, I suppose," he said, handing back the change. His companions laughed quietly, sensing the small victory he thought he had achieved by saying something remotely positive. She accepted the coins with a nod, keeping her composure. As they left the cafe, she couldn't help but notice the contrast once more, the confidence and arrogance in his step, the subtle sense of self-importance that clung to him. She watched as they disappeared into the street, a fleeting reminder of the gap between their lives. But even as she felt the sting of humiliation, she also felt a quiet determination. There was something about the way he carried himself, the subtle hints of tension beneath his arrogance, that made her curious. Perhaps, she thought, everyone has a side they try to hide, even those who seem untouchable. The rest of the morning continued in its usual rhythm, but the encounter lingered in her mind. Customers came and went, orders were taken and delivered, and the cafe hummed with activity. Yet, the memory of the CEO's smirk, his cutting words, and the brief glimpse of vulnerability beneath his polished exterior stayed with her. She wondered what secrets someone so powerful might be hiding and whether anyone would ever see them. The thought was fleeting, replaced by the immediate demands of her job, but it planted a seed of curiosity that would not easily be forgotten. By the time her shift ended, she felt a mixture of exhaustion and quiet satisfaction. She had faced a difficult situation with professionalism and grace, and she had survived. Outside, the city buzzed with life, indifferent to the small dramas within the cafe. She walked home slowly, her thoughts lingering on the morning's events. The encounter with the CEO was just one of many challenges she would face in her life, but it was a reminder of her resilience and strength. No matter how the world judged her, she knew her own worth, and she would carry that quietly, like a small flame that could not be extinguished. The cafe was quieter than usual the next morning, with only a few regular customers scattered among the tables. The young waitress moved with her usual precision, her steps swift, her hands steady, and her eyes attentive. Even after the previous day's encounter with the CEO, she kept her composure, determined not to let one arrogant person affect her work. Yet, she could not deny that his words and gestures had left a small mark on her, a mix of irritation and curiosity that lingered in her mind. She refilled cups and wiped down tables, listening to the soft hum of the espresso machine and the occasional clatter of plates. Her co-workers whispered quietly among themselves, casting furtive glances toward her. Some offered sympathetic smiles, others shook their heads in warning. Everyone had noticed the CEO's harsh behavior, and some worried about what might come next. The waitress, however, kept her focus on her work, knowing that professionalism was the best armor she had. Just as she was arranging a display of pastries, the bell above the door jingled. She glanced up and froze for a brief second. There he was, the CEO, stepping into the cafe once more. This time, he was accompanied by a few more people than before, and there was a faint tension in the air around him. The waitress took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and approached the table with a polite smile. "Good morning, sir. Would you like your usual order today?" she asked softly. He looked at her, his eyes sharp, and gave a small, dismissive nod. "Yes, but make sure it's done right this time. I don't have time for mistakes." She nodded without a word and hurried to the counter, preparing his order carefully. She noticed the critical way he watched her, his gaze sharp and calculating, as if he were testing her abilities. His companions whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing at her with a mix of amusement and uncertainty. The waitress worked efficiently, her hands steady despite the tension in the room. She made sure every detail was perfect, every cup precisely measured, every pastry fresh. When she returned to the table with the coffee and pastries, he raised an eyebrow and smirked. "Not bad," he said, though the tone carried a trace of sarcasm. "I suppose someone can do their job properly when they try." She smiled politely, hiding any sign of frustration. "Thank you, sir. I hope you enjoy it." As he sipped his coffee, the CEO began to make more pointed comments, not just about the service but also about the cafe itself. "Is this really the best you can offer? I've seen better places even in small towns," he said, shaking his head. His companions laughed lightly, joining in the ridicule, though the waitress could see that some of them felt uncomfortable with his harshness. She nodded quietly, acknowledging his words without responding with anger. She had learned that maintaining calm and professionalism was more powerful than reacting impulsively. Throughout the morning, he continued to make cutting remarks, testing her patience and composure. He questioned the quality of the pastries, the freshness of the coffee, and even the cleanliness of the tables. Each comment was delivered with a smirk, a subtle way to assert his superiority. The waitress noticed, however, a few small inconsistencies in his behavior. There were moments when he seemed distracted, almost nervous, as if he were worried about something beyond the cafe. His eyes would dart toward the door or the staff, and he occasionally checked his phone with a rapid, tense movement. Other customers began to notice the tension between the CEO and the waitress. Some whispered to each other, curious about the interaction, while others simply watched with quiet fascination. The waitress, however, kept her focus, moving gracefully from table to table, attending to other customers, refilling drinks, and clearing plates. She maintained a calm demeanor, her professionalism a shield against the CEO's sharp words. As the morning progressed, the waitress began to observe the CEO more closely. She noticed the way he tapped his fingers impatiently, the subtle glances he gave to his companions, and the tension that occasionally crossed his face. Despite his confident exterior, there were moments when he appeared uneasy, almost as if he were hiding something. She wondered what could make a man so powerful and seemingly untouchable feel this way. Her curiosity grew, but she knew better than to show it openly. During a brief lull, she had a moment to breathe and reflect. Her mind wandered to her own life, the struggles she faced, and the quiet determination that had carried her through difficult days. She thought about her family, the small apartment she called home, and the stack of unpaid bills waiting for her attention. The contrast between her world and the CEO's was stark, yet she felt a quiet strength in knowing that she had survived challenges before and carried herself with dignity. Her colleagues noticed the shift in her expression, sensing a mix of frustration and determination. They offered supportive smiles, but no words were necessary. The waitress had a way of handling difficult situations with quiet grace, and they knew she would continue to do so. Even when the CEO's remarks became sharper, she remained composed, responding with polite efficiency rather than anger or resentment. At one point, the CEO received a phone call and excused himself to a corner of the cafe. She noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers fidgeted with the phone, and the slight hesitation in his voice. It was a brief glimpse behind the mask of confidence he wore so effortlessly. When he returned to the table, he resumed his usual behavior, but the waitress had caught a small clue about the man behind the arrogance. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of orders, coffee refills, and careful attention to every detail. The waitress maintained her professionalism, keeping her focus on the work and ignoring the lingering sting of the CEO's ridicule. She noticed small details about him, the expensive watch, the designer clothes, the way he carried himself, all symbols of wealth and power. Yet beneath it all, there were signs of vulnerability, moments when his confidence wavered, even if only slightly. As the CEO and his companions finally prepared to leave, he tossed a few coins onto the table, his expression unreadable. "Not bad, I suppose," he said again, the faintest trace of acknowledgement in his voice. She accepted the coins with a nod, her smile polite and calm. He and his entourage left, the door jingling behind them, and the cafe returned to its usual rhythm. The waitress felt a mix of relief and lingering curiosity. The encounter had been challenging, but it had also sparked a sense of determination. She wondered about the man behind the arrogance, the reasons for his behavior, and the secrets he might be hiding. Even as she returned to her work, serving other customers with her usual care, the image of the CEO remained in her mind, a puzzle she could not yet solve. By the end of her shift, she was exhausted but satisfied. She had faced a difficult situation with grace and professionalism, and she had learned more about the complexities of human behavior. The CEO's ridicule had tested her patience, but it had also revealed her own strength and resilience. She walked home slowly, reflecting on the morning's events and the quiet determination that had carried her through. The encounter had left its mark not as a wound, but as a reminder of her courage and ability to navigate challenges with dignity. The next morning, the cafe was busy with the usual crowd of customers, but the young waitress moved through it with a quiet sense of alertness she had not felt before. Her mind kept returning to the CEO and his sharp words, his smirk, and the faint hint of unease she had glimpsed beneath his polished exterior. She could not shake the feeling that there was more to this man than his arrogance suggested, and a small spark of curiosity began to grow inside her. She served coffee and pastries with her usual care, but her eyes often wandered to the entrance, half expecting to see him walk in. As she moved between tables, she noticed the little details she had seen before. The expensive watch on a customer's wrist, the designer bag left casually on a chair, the quiet way some people carried themselves as if the world belonged to them. But today, she was thinking more critically, wondering about the stories behind these appearances. Around mid-morning, the cafe door jingled, and she turned to see him enter again. The CEO was alone this time, without his companions, and he looked slightly different. Less composed, almost hurried. She took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay professional, and approached his table with her polite smile. "Good morning, sir. Would you like your usual?" she asked softly. He looked at her and nodded, this time without the usual smirk. "Yes, and make it quick," he said, but there was a tension in his voice that was different from before. She nodded and prepared his coffee carefully, noticing the slight way his hands shook as he checked his phone. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she noticed. As she worked, she overheard him speaking quietly on his phone, his voice low and urgent. He seemed concerned about something, though she could not catch the words. She felt a sudden pang of curiosity mixed with caution. She had no right to eavesdrop, but she could not help noticing that even someone so powerful had worries and secrets. When she brought his coffee and pastries to the table, he looked at her briefly, almost distracted. "Thank you," he muttered, before returning to his phone call. She placed the tray carefully and stepped back, pretending to attend to another table but listening just enough to catch fragments of his conversation. He mentioned numbers, names, and a meeting that seemed critical. There was an urgency in his tone, a fear that he could not hide entirely. The waitress felt a mixture of caution and intrigue. She was used to dealing with difficult people, but this was different. She realized that there might be a side to him that no one else saw, a side that was anxious, human, and vulnerable. Her mind began to piece together the clues she had noticed over the past days, the small hesitations, the way he checked the room, the subtle tension in his posture. Something important was happening, something he wanted to keep hidden. Throughout the morning, she continued her work with her usual care, serving other customers and keeping the cafe running smoothly. But her mind was focused on him, trying to understand what was happening behind the polished exterior. She observed his interactions, his quick glances, the way he moved his hand nervously when he thought no one was looking. Each small detail added to the picture she was forming in her mind. At one point, he got up to leave briefly, and she noticed a folder he had dropped slightly as he sat down again. She discreetly glanced at it and saw papers filled with numbers, graphs, and official-looking documents. She did not touch them, but the glimpse was enough to confirm her suspicion that there was something important he was hiding, something related to his work and reputation. Her curiosity grew, but she reminded herself to be careful. She knew that observing quietly and noticing details without interfering was the safest way to understand what was going on. She began to think like a detective, piecing together small clues, the urgency in his phone calls, the tension in his movements, the way he avoided eye contact when he was stressed. There was a story behind this man, a story that no one else seemed to know. The cafe continued to buzz with activity. Customers came and went, some laughing, others absorbed in their own conversations. The waitress moved gracefully between them, attending to their needs while keeping her focus on the CEO. She noticed the way he reacted to small things. A sudden noise, a phone call, a glance from a colleague. Each reaction was a small piece of the puzzle, and she began to form a mental map of his behavior. As the morning passed, she became more confident in her observations. She noticed patterns. Certain words he used on the phone, the way he checked his watch at precise intervals, and the subtle tension in his shoulders when he sat at the table. She began to understand that he was worried about more than just the cafe or the immediate moment. There was a larger issue at play, something that mattered deeply to him and that he was trying to keep hidden from everyone else. During a brief quiet moment, she reflected on the situation. She thought about her own life and the challenges she had faced. She had learned to be observant, to read people, and to handle difficult situations with calm and care. These skills had helped her navigate the cafe and her life, and now they were allowing her to see a side of someone who seemed untouchable to others. She felt a sense of responsibility, not to interfere, but to understand and learn from what she observed. By mid-afternoon, the CEO left the cafe again, but the impression he left behind lingered. The waitress felt a mixture of curiosity and determination. She had glimpsed a hidden side of him, one that was worried, human, and vulnerable. She knew that there was a secret, something important that he was trying to protect. The fragments she had noticed, his phone calls, the dropped folder, his anxious movements, were all pieces of a larger story she had yet to fully understand. As she finished her shift, she reflected on the morning's events. She felt a sense of quiet accomplishment in observing without interfering, in noticing details that others might have missed. She realized that even the most powerful people had vulnerabilities, and that understanding those vulnerabilities required patience, attention, and careful observation. The CEO's arrogance had masked a deeper complexity, and she was beginning to see the truth behind the polished exterior. Walking home, she thought about the lessons she had learned. Patience, observation, and careful attention to detail were powerful tools, not just in her work at the cafe, but in life. She realized that understanding people required more than just listening to their words. It required noticing their actions, their hesitations, and the subtle signs of their emotions. The CEO's behavior had challenged her, but it had also taught her something valuable about human nature. By the time she reached her small apartment, she felt a mixture of exhaustion and curiosity. The encounter with the CEO was no longer just about his ridicule or her professionalism. It had become a puzzle, a story she was quietly trying to piece together. She wondered what secrets he was hiding, why he acted the way he did, and what consequences might come from the things he was trying to keep hidden. She sat by her window, looking out at the city, and allowed herself a moment of reflection. The cafe, the CEO, and the morning's events were all part of a larger world she was only beginning to understand. She felt a quiet determination to observe, to learn, and perhaps, one day, to uncover the truth behind the carefully constructed facade. She knew that patience and attention to detail would be her guides, and that the story she was witnessing was far from over. As night fell, she prepared for the next day with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the CEO would return, and that each encounter would provide more pieces of the puzzle. She felt a growing confidence in her ability to notice, to understand, and to navigate the complexities of human behavior. The mystery of the CEO's secret was no longer just a curiosity. It was a challenge, one that she was quietly determined to meet. The next day, the cafe felt different. There was the usual bustle of customers and the clatter of dishes, but the young waitress moved with a sharper focus than ever. The previous days had taught her to notice subtle details, to see beyond appearances, and today, she was determined to pay attention to every small clue. The CEO had not returned yet, and the air was filled with the usual morning chatter, but she could sense that today might be important. As she served coffee and cleared tables, she reflected on what she had noticed about him. The nervous flickers in his expression, the urgency in his movements, and the brief glimpses of documents and phone conversations. She knew that patience and observation would be her allies. She had seen enough to understand that this man, so powerful and arrogant, was hiding something significant, and she felt a quiet determination to uncover it. Around mid-morning, the bell above the cafe door jingled, and she looked up. There he was, the CEO, entering with a tense air that immediately drew attention. He was not with his usual entourage. Instead, he seemed to be alone and more anxious than before. His eyes scanned the room quickly, as if he were worried about something. The waitress straightened her posture, offered her polite smile, and approached him. "Good morning, sir. Would you like your usual order?" she asked, keeping her tone calm and professional. He nodded quickly, his eyes darting around the cafe. "Yes, and hurry, please. I don't have much time," he said, his voice carrying a subtle tension that she had not heard before. She prepared his coffee and pastries with meticulous care, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. As she worked, she noticed the way he frequently checked his phone, the way his eyes scanned the room, and the slight tremor in his fingers. It was clear that he was anxious, perhaps worried about something that could have serious consequences. Her curiosity intensified, but she reminded herself to observe carefully without interfering. When she brought his order to the table, he barely acknowledged her, his attention absorbed by his phone. She placed the tray carefully, stepped back, and continued serving other customers while keeping subtle glances toward him. As she moved through the cafe, she overheard fragments of his conversation, a name, a date, a reference to a meeting. Pieces of a puzzle were slowly coming together in her mind, and she realized that the CEO was trying to protect something important. While serving another table, she noticed a folder left slightly open on his chair when he stood to take a phone call outside. The documents inside contained spreadsheets, charts, and letters that hinted at financial dealings and decisions that could have serious implications. She did not touch anything, but she memorized the details she could see from a distance. The pieces were starting to form a picture. There was a secret he desperately wanted to hide, and it could change how people saw him if it became known. Throughout the morning, the waitress continued her careful observation. She noticed the way he responded to interruptions, the subtle tension in his jaw, and the brief moments when he seemed unsure of his surroundings. She began to connect the dots. This was not just a man concerned with business. This was a man whose reputation and power were at risk if certain things were discovered. The thought both intrigued and alarmed her. As the cafe grew busier, she maintained her professionalism, serving other customers with her usual care and grace. But her mind was focused on the CEO, tracking his behavior and noting small inconsistencies that hinted at deeper secrets. She began to plan carefully, thinking about how she might uncover more information without drawing attention to herself. She knew that acting hastily could backfire, but she also realized that opportunities might present themselves if she stayed alert. At one point, the CEO stepped outside for a brief call, leaving his documents unattended. She saw the chance to gather more information subtly, glancing over the materials without touching them. The documents confirmed her suspicions. There were decisions and actions he had taken that he was trying to hide, actions that could affect his image and reputation. She felt a surge of resolve. This was the moment when she could use her observations to reveal the truth, but she had to be cautious and strategic. Returning to her regular duties, she continued to observe the CEO's interactions. She noticed that even his body language around other staff and customers was calculated, controlled, and tense. Every small gesture, every glance, told a story of someone trying to maintain a facade while dealing with the fear of exposure. She carefully noted each detail, understanding that these small signs could help her understand the bigger picture. The tension in the cafe built as the morning wore on. Customers came and went, some oblivious to the drama unfolding, others quietly observing the CEO's behavior. She noticed how people reacted to him, the subtle deference, the slight discomfort, the occasional surprise at his intensity. She realized that even someone with immense power could not control everything, and that vulnerabilities existed even in those who seemed untouchable. By early afternoon, the waitress saw a real opportunity. The CEO had stepped away momentarily, leaving his documents and phone on the table. She discreetly noted everything she could, mentally organizing the information she had gathered over the past days. The fragments she had noticed, the phone calls, the dropped folder, the anxious gestures, now fit together in a coherent way. She understood the secret he was trying to hide, the truth that could change how people viewed him. She considered her options carefully. She could expose the secret, reveal the truth to the right people, and ensure that justice was served, but she also knew that she had to act carefully to protect herself. She planned each step mentally, considering timing, audience, and method. Her patience and careful observation had brought her to this point, and she was determined to proceed with intelligence and caution. When the CEO returned and prepared to leave, the waitress felt a mixture of anticipation and determination. She approached him politely, her demeanor calm and composed. Her mind raced with possibilities, and she knew that the moment to act was near. She had observed, learned, and prepared, and now it was time to turn her careful attention into action. As he left the cafe, she watched him closely, noting his gestures and expressions, understanding that the secret he carried was significant and impactful. She knew that revealing it would require courage, strategy, and timing, but she also knew that she had the insight and presence of mind to do so effectively. The lessons of patience, observation, and careful attention had prepared her for this moment, and she felt ready. Walking through the bustling streets after her shift, she reflected on what had happened. The morning had confirmed everything she had suspected. The CEO was hiding something important, and it was within her ability to expose it. She felt a quiet strength, a sense of purpose, and a determination to act wisely. She knew that the right moment would come, and when it did, she would reveal the truth with clarity, courage, and dignity. The sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the city. The waitress sat by her window, reviewing the events of the day in her mind. She thought about the CEO's behavior, the fragments of information she had gathered, and the careful observations that had led her to this point. She realized that her professionalism, patience, and attention to detail had given her an advantage that few could match. She was prepared to expose the truth, to reveal the secret that had been hidden for so long, and to do so in a way that was fair, accurate, and undeniable. As night fell, she prepared for the next day with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the CEO might return, and that opportunities to act could present themselves at any moment. She felt confident in her ability to navigate the situation with intelligence and grace, to reveal the truth without compromising herself, and to stand strong in the face of someone who had tried to belittle her. The story was reaching a turning point, and she was ready to take the steps that would expose the secret and bring clarity to the situation. The morning she had been waiting for finally arrived, though it did not feel dramatic at first. The cafe looked the same as always. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Cups clinked against saucers. People sat at their usual tables, scrolling through their phones or chatting softly. But inside, the young waitress felt a steady calm, the kind that comes when someone has already made up their mind. She had spent the last few nights thinking carefully about what she had seen and heard. She had not rushed. She had not acted out of anger. Instead, she had quietly organized everything in her thoughts. The numbers she glimpsed in the open folder. The urgent phone calls. The nervous way the CEO looked over his shoulder. The pieces now formed a clear picture. His biggest secret was not something dramatic or violent. It was something that struck at the heart of his public image. He was known as a leader who spoke proudly about fairness, about supporting small businesses and hardworking people. He gave interviews about honesty and responsibility. Yet the documents she had seen showed something different. His company had been quietly planning to close several small local branches while publicly promising expansion. Jobs would disappear. Families would struggle. And the announcement had been delayed to protect the company's stock value until a private deal was complete. She had not stolen anything. She had not broken into anything. But she had seen enough to understand the truth. More importantly, she had overheard him boasting loudly in the cafe about how much he respected hard-working people. The memory of him saying that while looking down at her uniform had stayed with her. Late that morning, the bell above the door rang again. He walked in. He looked tired. The confidence was still there, but it was thinner now, stretched over stress. He sat at his usual table and glanced around the room quickly. She approached him with the same calm smile she had always worn. "Your usual?" she asked gently. "Yes," he replied, barely looking at her. And quickly, she nodded and walked to the counter. Her hands did not shake. Her breathing was steady. Today was not about revenge. It was about truth. As she placed his coffee in front of him, she spoke clearly but softly. "I hope the meeting about the branch closures goes the way you expect." His hand froze around the cup. For the first time since she had known him, he looked directly at her without arrogance. There was no smirk, no sarcasm. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice lower now. She kept her expression neutral. "I heard you on the phone the other day, and I saw the documents when they were left open. I did not mean to look, but it was hard to ignore." His jaw tightened. He glanced around to see if anyone else was listening. A few nearby customers had gone quiet. Not because she had shouted, she hadn't, but because the tone in his voice had changed. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said sharply, though the confidence in his tone was fading. She did not argue. She simply continued, her voice steady. "You speak about supporting workers, about protecting small communities. But those branches you plan to close, people depend on those jobs." There was a long silence between them. He leaned back in his chair. For a moment, he looked less like a powerful executive and more like a tired man carrying something heavy. "It's business," he said finally. "You wouldn't understand." She met his gaze calmly. "Maybe I understand more than you think. I work 2 jobs. My parents rely on me. I know what it means when a paycheck disappears." A few customers were openly watching now. The cafe owner stood near the counter, uncertain but alert. The CEO rubbed his forehead. "Those decisions aren't simple. There are investors. There are pressures. And there are families," she replied gently. Her tone was not accusing. It was honest. What happened next surprised everyone, including her. He did not explode in anger. He did not threaten her. Instead, he let out a long breath, as if the air had been trapped inside him for days. "You think I enjoy this?" he said quietly. "You think I don't know what it looks like?" It was the first time he had spoken without superiority. She did not step back. "Then why mock people like me?" she asked. "Why talk about respect while acting the opposite?" That question seemed to land harder than anything else. The room was completely silent now. He looked down at the coffee in his hand. "Because it's easier," he admitted after a moment. "Easier to feel in control somewhere when everything else feels like it's slipping." The confession hung in the air. She had expected denial, maybe anger. She had not expected honesty. "You don't have to control everything," she said quietly. "But you do have to be honest about who your decisions affect." He looked at her again, and this time there was something new in his eyes. Not arrogance, not fear, something closer to reflection. A man at a nearby table spoke up carefully. If branches are closing, people deserve to know early. It gives them time. Another customer nodded. The CEO noticed the attention now. His image, the carefully built reputation, was standing in the middle of a small cafe, fragile and exposed. He could have denied it all. He could have walked out. Instead, he did something unexpected. He stood up. "You're right about one thing," he said, looking at the waitress. "I have spoken about fairness. And maybe I haven't shown it." He turned slightly toward the room. The announcement was going to be delayed. That's true. But maybe it shouldn't be. The cafe owner looked stunned. The waitress felt her heart pounding, but she stayed calm. "This isn't the place for a press conference," he added with a faint, tired smile. "But it is a place where I was reminded of something important." He reached into his pocket, placed money on the table, more than enough for the bill, and paused. "I'm not promising miracles," he said to her quietly, "but I will revisit those decisions, and I will announce them honestly." Then he left. The bell above the door rang softly as it closed behind him. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then conversations slowly returned, louder than before. People whispered, some impressed, some shocked. The cafe owner walked over to her. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm fine." And she was. Later that week, news broke online. The company released an earlier-than-planned statement about restructuring. It acknowledged potential branch closures but also introduced a support plan for affected workers, including transfers and financial assistance. It was not perfect. Some branches would still close. But there was transparency now. There was preparation. In one interview, the CEO spoke briefly about being reminded that leadership meant facing uncomfortable truths directly. He did not mention the cafe. He did not mention her. But his tone was different from before. Life at the cafe slowly returned to normal. Customers still came and went. Coffee still steamed in white cups. The young waitress still worked long hours. She did not become famous. She did not quit dramatically. She simply continued, with the same quiet dignity she had always carried. But something had changed. When the CEO returned weeks later, he came alone. He ordered politely. He did not mock. When she brought his coffee, he said thank you, and this time it sounded real. She nodded and gave the same calm smile. There was no applause, no dramatic music, just two people standing on equal ground for the first time. She understood something important now. Power does not always look like wealth or position. Sometimes power is simply the courage to speak calmly when it would be easier to stay silent. As she wiped down a nearby table, she felt lighter. Not because she had exposed a secret, but because she had stayed true to herself. Outside, the city moved forward as it always did. Cars passed. People hurried along sidewalks. Inside the cafe, the rhythm of ordinary life continued. And in that ordinary place, respect had quietly been restored.